So without further ado, please welcome everybody, all the panelists, and we'll kick off the event with our first speaker, which will be Reinhold Martin.
Okay, into which machine do I speak? All of them? I suppose, yes, very good. Well, hi. So, yes, first to thank so much our hosts, so many hosts, Joseph, Jessica, Shumi, and Umberto first, the Architecture Exchange, for inventing this format and this opportunity for all of us to engage in what promises to be a very interesting dialogue and perhaps debate, and to Brett for his hospitality, and of course to Chantal for her patience with disciplinary translation, no doubt, among other things. Although I am nominated here as an architect, I have to sort of qualify that. I identify these days as a retired architect. I don't practice architecture. I was trained as an architect and have practiced architecture, but have for many years now preoccupied myself with architectural scholarship and in both the history and theory of architecture in cities. And so what I'm going to offer to you today, to all of us, are essentially theoretical fragments that respond to some of the propositions that Chantal has offered to us over some years now, but also perhaps between the lines, refer to some of the raging debates that continue to preoccupy all of us in this troubled field. So I'll begin by just asking another question. There are many questions here, and the version of the question, let's say, that I begin with is, can political life be described in properly spatial terms? We could say properly architectural terms. Let's just say spatial for now. Anyway, the question has been asked many times, often enough with the classical polis as a principal referent. Not necessarily coincident with the city or the city-state per se. The polis is, as Hannah Arendt would have it, a space of appearance before others for the purposes of what she calls acting and speaking together in a political fashion. Although Arendt uses the term in a general sense, she locates its origins in Periclean Athens, an intensely architectural site, where citizens frequently gathered in the urban space of the agora or marketplace. However, while noting that tyrants, as she calls them, had persistently sought to transform the Greek agora into, quote, an assemblage of shops like the bazaars of Oriental despotism, Arendt does not mention the most visible monument to the polis as a site of political speech, as it were, the literal architecture, which would have been the Bouleuterion, or council chamber, located in the agora's central precinct, where 500 or so propertied male citizens serving as representatives of the people, or demos, assembled regularly to debate and vote on day-to-day political matters and attend to the daily business of the city-state. Stretched to its widest scope, then, this scene in the Bouleuterion constitutes an imaginary ground on which the figure of democracy has been erected over the past 3 centuries or so in European and North American political discourse. Reconstructed archaeologically, the Bouleuterion or Assembly Hall exhibits, in other words, literally, taken literally, the Assembly Hall exhibits several distinct, although hardly unique spatial characteristics. Distance from dwelling houses, inward orientation, and enclosure. Another space, however, more decisively locates the polis as topos, during the city's, or in other words, locates the polis topologically, which is where my emphasis is going to be. During the city-state's periods of democratic rule, once a month, 6,000 or so Athenian citizens would gather in a popular assembly on the Pnyx. You know the Pnyx? It's a very nice place to go. In contrast to the representative nature of assembly on the Bouleuterion, and taking into account the complex differentiation of the Athenian populace into socioeconomic strata and by gender, which limited citizenship and participation in formal political life to male property holders, the Pnyx was much closer to being the site of what today we would call direct democracy. The Pnyx is located on a small hill adjacent to the agora and opposite the ancient Acropolis. Today it resembles a large earthwork in which a slightly sloped semicircular open-air auditorium has been cut essentially into the side of the hill, facing inwards towards an orator's podium or bema. Archaeologists tell us that the Pnyx was constructed in 3 stages, from the 6th century BCE to the 4th century BCE, although it's unclear whether the 3rd reconstruction was ever completed. They actually know relatively little about the Pnyx and how it was used. Some accounts point out that the orientation of the auditorium away from the Acropolis, on the slopes of the Acropolis, is where earlier assemblies had been held. This orientation away seems to indicate a turning away from divine authority in a gesture of what our era might call secularization. Archaeologists do not always agree even on how many citizens typically occupied the Pnyx during meetings, although consensus tends towards 6,000, which was the number required for a quorum. All sorts of inducements were tried to encourage or coerce citizens to climb the hill at dawn to attend the meetings. They couldn't actually get people up there in the mornings, apparently, including a stipend for political service not unlike that offered for jury service. Relatively little is known about how the assemblies were conducted, as I said, including even such mundane details as whether participants sat or stood during the deliberations. Regardless of these unknowns, it is fair to suggest, I think, that the popular assemblies held at the Pnyx offer the most accurate paradigm of Arendt's space of appearance in the ancient polis. The popular assemblies also help us to grasp the polis as a set of topological relations. I say topological rather than topographical since, although by virtue of its location on a hilltop, the Pnyx is, like the Bouleuterion and like any modern parliament, though by different means, it lies outside the everyday space of the city. So it's kind of up there, off to the side and up out of the way. It thus helps constitute the polis by way of a primary topological distinction, as outside and away. In Arendt's schema, as in ancient Athens, the polis stands conceptually differentiated from the household, or oikos, as the political is differentiated from the social, and as outside is differentiated from inside. The household is a site of production and reproduction, which by virtue of being sharply distinguished from the polis while also supporting it, remains subject to despotic rule in the household by the same male citizens who, in principle if not in fact, engaged in monthly democratic deliberations on the Pnyx. Now, in her idealization of the Athenian model, which endorses this division of political life from economic life, or public from private, Arendt tacitly accepts this contradiction. She and many of her interpreters also generalize the underlying topology into an imaginary map or diagram by which any city might be partitioned, in which the public space of the polis is opposed to, but also dependent on, the private space of the household. To be sure, the opposition of public to private is easily deconstructed and has been many times. But I want to dwell on it here for a moment to explore its implications for a political topology adequate to the contemporary city. In a short essay in the exhibition catalog, Making Things Public, edited by Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel, Chantal Mouffe summarizes several key aspects of her political thought. the irreducible antagonism that defines the political, the differentiation of the political from the social, or the realm of sedimented practices, the role of hegemony in temporarily stabilizing foundational contingencies, and the taming, as she calls it, of the Schmittian friend-enemy relation into an agonistic set of we-they contests where the adversarial component remains irreducible but is based on mutual recognition rather than annihilation. In a publication for which, in Latour's introduction, the Assembly, and more surreptitiously the Parliament, acts as a kind of master signifier for political activity, this is Latour, not Mouffe, it is not surprising that Mouffe speculates in the final section of her essay on what she calls, quote, the consequences for envisaging the public space of the agonistic model of democratic politics. Her answer is an elaboration of the radically democratic pluralism that she and Ernesto Laclau developed as an alternative to the 20th century's univocal socialisms, as well as to oppose a liberal pluralism that equates democracy with an enforced consensus shaped by market-oriented individualism rather than genuinely adversarial political debate. For an agonistic politics that presupposes irreconcilable positions and interests, Mouffe argues, quote, public spaces are always plural. The agonistic confrontation takes place on a multiplicity of discursive surfaces. End quote. I think we'll probably hear many quotes from Chantal, and we can accumulate them. While acknowledging the evident affinities, she therefore distances herself from Arendt's own agonism, which, notwithstanding its emphasis on plurality and contestation, Mouffe calls an agonism without antagonism. Agonism without antagonism is a nice formulation, I think. The problem is, as I read it, that Arendt, like Jürgen Habermas a bit later on, considers consensus to be the defining feature of political life, albeit via persuasive argumentation rather than rational proof. Hence, Mouffe's concluding exhortation, quote, this is just in this short essay, which I really recommend to you as a very nice synopsis. Quote, what a democratic politics requires is the fostering of a multiplicity of public spaces of agonistic confrontation. A multiplicity of public spaces of agonistic confrontation. So I refer to this short essay because I think it succinctly connects the main theses of Mouffe's work from the collaboration with Laclau in Hegemony and Socialist Strategy onwards, with a spatial imagination, by locating the political in what she calls there a multiplicity of public spaces. In taking issue with Arendtian agonism, Mouffe does not explicitly reject the division of public and private on which it is based. On the contrary, she seems to accept Arendt's agonism in the human condition, that this distinction, which modernity has gradually obliterated, ontologically grounds the differentiation of the political from the social, however unstable and fugitive that differentiation may be. Now, I should qualify that she and Laclau certainly do suggest that, quote, the distinctions public-private, civil society, political society are only the result of a certain type of hegemonic articulation. And they define the social as a non-sutured space cross-cut with antagonistic fissures, and hence politically constituted. Still, it is difficult not to conclude that the space of appearance remains paradigmatic of political space, for which the Athenian Pnyx stands now as just one among a number of public arenas, large and small, in which the agon or struggle might be waged. Now, in some contrast to this notion of the political as lodged in the res publica, which, as Latour reminds us, could just as well be a public thing as a public space, a more classically Marxist critique of capitalist modernity would focus on specific sites of production, like the factory, as topoi of political organization and contestation. During the late 1960s, for example, the Italian workerists responded to the failure of organized labor and the Communist Party to decisively challenge industrial capitalism from the factory floor by emphasizing historical changes whereby the whole of society had effectively become a site of production. Alternatively formulated as the social factory by Mario Tronti, or the factory without walls by Antonio Negri, This diffusion became central to accounts of informal post-Fordist or post-industrial production, in which the older division between the workplace and home, or between work and leisure, had for all practical purposes been abolished. Now, although most visibly associated with newer forms of intellectual work, gathered together under the somewhat misleading category of immaterial labor, perhaps you've heard this expression, this accounts for this account of the dispersion or deterritorialization of factory work, and of both exploitation and of organized political resistance, is the strict obverse of Arendt's public sphere. Particularly in its post-Fordist iterations, the factory without walls is nothing other than Arendt's household, or oikos, the realm of the social but also of production and reproduction, generalized. In that sense, the workerist model, especially as updated by Negri in his recent collaborations with Michael Hart, matches up with Arendt's claim that the modern period has seen the replacement of the properly political agon with household administration under the sign of the social. Now, that Hart and Negri more frequently analyze the consequent regime through the lens of Foucauldian biopolitics rather than through Arendt's categories is of lesser importance for us here, since, despite their significant differences, the two models converge on a crucial point. In short, Arendt's animal laborans, as she calls this social being, is the homo economicus of Foucault's late reflections on neoliberalism. The economic, in the form of household management, enters into Arendt's scheme as what Mouffe would call hegemony. As animal laborans overtakes homo faber, the social overtakes the political, and managerial capitalism is consolidated around a human subject reconceived as what Foucault called an entrepreneurial abilities machine, or human capital, in need of biopolitical care. Which returns us to Athens, believe it or not. This is, I think, actually quite funny, that among the fragmentary evidence that archaeologists have adduced that they've used to reconstruct the workings of the Pnyx is a passage from Aristophanes in his comedy, The Assemblywomen, in which was most so they're using a piece of Greek comedy to reconstruct what they think happened in these popular assemblies. Of classical theater, in other words. So the Assemblywoman was most likely written by Aristophanes and performed in the 4th century BCE. In the play, a group of Athenian women, disguised as men, leave their respective households at dawn, enter the Pnyx, and join the popular assembly. There, they propose that women rather than men govern the polis. And since the disguised women are in the majority, they win the vote and assume power. In the play's opening scene, as the women gather on a city street and don their disguises, they conduct a mock assembly to practice their speeches and decide who among them should address the people. After some unconvincing attempts from the others, the play's protagonist, named Praxagora, emerges as the group's lead orator. Her practice speech is a blend of accusation. She's like practicing this speech that she's going to give in the Pnyx. She says, for example, you, the sovereign people, are responsible for this mess. That's the accusation. Then logic. I propose that we turn our governance of the polis to the women, since they are so competent as stewards and treasurers of our households. And morality. Their character, women's character, is superior than ours. So she's trying out all these arguments. In that sense, Aristophanes parodies the arts of persuasion around which a properly agonistic polis might form. But what is most interesting for our purposes is that we never see the women at the Pnyx. Indeed, we never see the Pnyx at all. Having chosen their representative, the women depart for the assembly. They go off stage. And after a choral interlude and an encounter with the men of Athens dressed in their wives' clothes, an encounter on the street, for the women had taken their clothes, the action resumes with Praxagora presiding now over a reformed polis. So they've been to the assembly, changed the law, and now the women of Athens or the assembly women of Athens are in charge. The polis that emerges is essentially communist in that it renders all property common among all citizens, although slaves remain excluded, and establishes social equality and sexual freedoms. But again, our question here is less how it does so than where it does so. So it's a slight modification of the official question for the gathering. If anything, the symbolic and practical role of the popular assembly gathered on the Pnyx, by which the new regime was voted in, gives way to sedimented everyday activities that revolve around food and sex. Still, whatever political consensus has been achieved was illusory as it was obtained by deceit. Underlying antagonisms remain. Praxagora makes good on her proposal to as she says, remodel the city into one big household, while the Pnyx itself remains off stage. The actual space of assembly never appears. We can interpret its occult position in three ways. One, it remains awaiting further political deliberation. In other words, they can always go back up there and debate. Two, it is obsolete as the post-political utopia has been achieved, this communist utopia. Or three, it is redundant as politics has moved into the household. Now, although the titular characters of Aristophanes' play are the assemblywomen of Athens, their politics are enacted not so much in the assembly or even in the street where they first rehearse their speeches, as in the day-to-day work of governing, where household administration has become paradigmatic. In Mouffe and Laclau's sense, this is the work of hegemony, the institutionalizing of a dominant regime that brings temporary order to the contingencies around which the agon or political struggle plays out. That the rule of women reverses that of men does not fundamentally alter the terms of struggle. It's always possible for the legitimacy of the new government to be debated anew in a popular assembly. The status of the Pnyx as the archetypal space of politics seems thereby preserved, except insofar as women in the classical polis are representatives of the social rather than the political. Yes, their actions, in other words, we cannot essentialize this, and their actions can most certainly be said that they have laid claim on the space of appearance, and thereby changed valence or switched sides. But those same actions could equally and quite undecidedly, I think, be said to have annulled that space, which was coded by male citizenry officially. That is where the constitutive asymmetry lies, in the precedence of public over private in the determination of the polis, and therefore of the political. Remember that one of Praxagora's arguments to the assembly was that women ought to govern because they are, quote, so competent as stewards and treasurers of our households. That the assemblywomen achieve their aims in Aristophanes' play does not simply mean that the historically male polis has been feminized. It means that the political order as such has been overturned. Already at the alleged point of origin then, in classical Athens, the polis was capable at least, of being reconceived as a household, and oikos to be governed like a domestic space. That this domestic space writ large could take the place of the space of appearance rather than simply become that space, and still democratically refound the polis, is the anti-essentialist wager with which we, as moderns, must play. Incomplete and ambiguous though it may be, the possibility announced by Aristophanes is also an answer from within the classical tradition to Mouffe and Laclau's call to invent new contingent hegemonies capable of displacing the liberal capitalist one that currently presides over the playing fields of the political. Not because it puts women in charge, but because it designates housekeeping, as Arendt derisively called the managerial disposition, as the locus of the political, within which, rather than outside of which, the agon might occur, in a kind of internalization of the Pnyx, made possible by its initial constitution as radically outside. The Pnyx, then, as a paradoxical space of disappearance. The wager also being that the social, which according to Arendt has neutralized contestation among a plurality of voices, can inaugurate a political topology sensitive to Mouffe's exhortation that we take plurality as foundational rather than circumstantial. This type of political topology, wherein the polis is potentially reconstituted everywhere except in the formal assembly, which remains outside the frame, as it were, is related to but also different from that imagined by theorists of a factory without walls, in which the social field and the means of production coincide. It shares with these theorists an emphasis on the economic sphere, in which the social factory, which Negri would later designate simply as the metropolis, and the household are one and the same thing. But rather than conceiving the metropolis as a factory writ large, or reverting to the older Renaissance notion of the city as a large house, it takes seriously the reversal of the political order established by the new hegemony of the social. However much, then, we justly desire and agitate for a more robust public realm, such a thing, a reconstituted res publica, will remain condemned to repeat its past unless we attend to the more basic repetitions on which it is founded. These are the repetitions of the social, the small technical rituals by which we are governed. For that's another way of describing hegemony, as repetition. And if we would be wise not to ignore it, we would also be wise to consider any hegemony capable of replacing the current order to be one in which repetition is recognized not only as what underpins political institutions, like, for example, the once a month meetings on the Pnyx or any other sort of scheduled political activity, but also social practice, including the day-to-day activities of caring for oneself, for others, and for the collective household. So just a concluding note here, simply to observe that housing is, in fact, one such repetition. It's a commonplace among architects and urbanists that housing is a privileged site of political articulation within the city. It's almost a cliche. For about 100 years, the construction and maintenance of housing has been a key arena in which socialist or welfare states have attempted to mitigate the predatory effects of speculative capital. Housing has also been a site where these two historical agents, let's call them states and markets, have colluded to further the interests of capital in the form of real estate development, for example. None of which, however, exhausts the real political makeup of what Friedrich Engels called the housing question. In Engels' original formulation, that question extends well beyond the proletarianization of workers newly migrated to the great modern metropolis, though this was clearly a motivating concern. It opens on to the inherently political character of the house itself. That in our own era of informal labor and immaterial production, factory and house seem to have merged, only argues further for a thought that is capable of considering the house, and with it, housing, as a space in which the agon repeats, daily. Then, and only then, will we have grasped the changing topology of the polis.